have Homo sapiens come into the picture around 200 to 250,000 years ago. Not a lot of them. A small subpopulation would have been a larger range of variation in the bipedal primate category of the time, or even of the Homo category of that time. So you have about 30,000 from which we, us, are descended. This all happens in sub-Saharan Africa. Africa is vital, central to most large primate evolution and certainly central to Homo sapiens. And from Africa, Homo sapiens go into all parts of the globe, encountering sometimes other large-brained hominins like the Neanderthals and Denisovans, but those would eventually fade out, leaving us with our one interbreeding species of Homo sapiens today, descended from that smaller group and of about 200 to 250,000 years ago. Different climate regions would open up the possibility of movement for a certain period of time. 200,000 years ago, you have in this part of Africa, probably, that's where we have the best evidence for Homo sapiens, and then spreading into other parts of Africa. And then they knew to move into this Middle Eastern region about 75 to 50,000 years ago. In part, probably because there were some climate shifts that were happening that opened up the possibility of moving into these areas. From there, they moved into Asia first, into this area of South Asia, and made it to Australia. So you might remember that Homo erectus comes all in these areas and gets out to parts of Asia, but Homo sapiens are the only ones to be able to cross this large body of water here and get into Australia. It's an incredible feat at about 65,000 years ago. Another period of time in which the climate changes is probably around this time, around 25 to 15,000 years ago, when things cool and warm up enough that it opens up routes across and enables the population of the Americas. So people were probably up in this area in what we call Beringia and had a pretty established population on that island. But as the climate changed, they were then able to make this move into the Americas as well. These kinds of climate shifts open up windows for human migration. But we do have to remember that people are always migrating all the time. So we have this incredible populating of the world by Homo sapiens, and we have to ask, well, what helped them do it? I want to start back a little bit though with some very recent find, or it's a find that they saw these skulls already in Morocco and then they reinterpreted them. These are now considered to be some of the earliest Homo sapiens skulls. And they're at about 300,000 years ago, so it pushes our time frame back a little bit. They're not as modern as some of the other examples from sub-Saharan Africa, but it again illustrates two things. One, that human evolution is following a mosaic pattern. That is to say, not all the traits arrive at once. They come in at different times and different speeds, and it's not like there's just one thing gradually turning in to people that we would recognize today. So that's one lesson from this. The other lesson is there are things going on all across and within the African continent. We just often do not have a lot of fossil evidence for that. So we have talked about how fragmentary the fossil record is, how difficult it is to even get fossils to preserve. We're getting more stuff now from the DNA evidence, but there's just so much we still don't know and will never know about these populations in Africa. We use this word modern, and modern usually refers to what is happening in the now, but the way that scientists use a term like modern is to distinguish when a creature would be within the range of us today. When we say that anatomically modern humans appear 200,000 years ago in Africa, is to say that they are anatomically the same as people today, or would fit into the range of human variation today. It's not, it's a funny term because to say something that was modern, that was 200,000 years ago, is a little weird, but that's the way it's defined. Now, they also use a term known as behavioral modernity, and that has to do with the use of language or noticing differences. Behavioral modernity refers to being able to think in a complex way, to plan things, to coordinate groups, to communicate something like probably a pretty sophisticated language, perhaps not anything like what we do today, and to have different social structures, different family types, and how they would relate to each other. Hard to know, but we know there was something. There were different patterns going on. And we see social structures emerge among primate groups. We talked about chimpanzees and bonobos and the way that they would relate to each other. But humans take this to a whole different level and have marriage ceremonies and start, we see evidence of people intentionally bury, or we see maybe some burial rituals going on 110,000 years ago. So something is happening there that is above the range that we had seen before. And there's been a lot of debate about when we see this thing called behavioral modernity. People usually see it, or I would say the consensus is now that this behavioral modernity starts to emerge around 150,000 years ago in Africa, which makes sense because that's where people were. And from Africa, it goes out into the rest of the world. Now, I say that this has been debated because I, there's sometimes people have seen a gap between when anatomically modern humans show up, that is to say that we can see in their features and their skeletons and things that they are biologically like us, and when behavioral modernity shows up, things like art and evidence of structures, clothing, and thinking and language. And as we've done more archaeology, this gap is closing. That is to say, the idea was once upon a time, there's this idea that there might be 100,000 year gap, and that you see behavioral modernity emerge about 50,000 years ago. It seems like that's something of an archaeological illusion. And what I mean by archaeological illusion is the people that fund archaeology usually come out of European or North American institutions, and they have the money to go places, but they like their own stuff. They'll go to their own caves and they go and dig up their own places. They found a lot of things that are old in their own places, but there hasn't been as many studies in Africa. There's still a lot of behavioral modernity to be found. It just hasn't been done because archaeology has been limited in these areas. People always like to go looking for King Arthur's sword or something that's buried right around them, and they don't look for these kinds of more important things. For example, speaking of art, recently we have found this cave painting.
Pretty nice.
Pretty nice. Pretty nice. It would be nice. You should get one of these or make your wall into one of these. This was found in Indonesia and is dated to about 45,000 years ago. This is the reason this is such an important find is because for a very, very long time, if you wanted to see cave paintings, everybody would be like, oh, go to France and go to Spain. And I'm not saying don't go to France and go to Spain. Definitely, if you can, those are some amazing cave paintings dating at about 40 to 45,000 years ago. But now we have also found Same stuff going on in Indonesia at about 45,000 years ago. So our revised timeline on this is we haven't found cave paintings in Africa, but we have found evidence that people were making paints, pigments, and they were doing stuff with figurines, other art that hasn't preserved perhaps quite as well as early as 75,000 years ago. And then you see cave paintings in France and Indonesia, Spain at about 45,000 years ago. Now, I don't want to get into, some people get into a contest and are like, Indonesia is even earlier. To me, that's not so important, dating exactly who got there first, because what it indicates is that there's a package of traits coming out of Africa that when people come into the rest of the world, they're already ready to sing and dance and make specialized tools and paint and do all of the artistic type things that we might even like to have today in our own rooms. We might even not be as good as they were. Hopefully, some of us are, but I certainly couldn't be. So we see this package of modernity traits, not only physical, biological, but the ability to do art. So if you look on page 183, they talk about anatomical modifications in Homo sapiens, the hyaloid bone and other stuff that makes us capable to do the kinds of speech patterns we do today. But we can also see that in order to do art, in order to coordinate things like make water crafts that could go across the kinds of water they must have traveled across in order to develop different hunting and gathering patterns. That means you have to have what we called cumulative culture. You have to be able to build up knowledge across generations. And to do that, it's good to watch what other people are doing and to learn from that. But you also need some form of symbolic communication to coordinate your group, tell people what they should be doing, to understand the meaning of what people are doing when they're painting something on a wall. What's that supposed to be? What are we supposed to think about that? What kinds of stories are we going to be telling about those paintings or that or through what is probably the oldest form of art that doesn't preserve archaeologically is dance. Being able to dance is a form of symbolic communication, and it's crucial for passing on knowledge, accumulating knowledge, and doing what we call cumulative culture. So, the way that Homo sapiens are able to do this is because we are quite flexible and adaptable. It's not that we are pre-made to live in any one of these environments. You see Homo sapiens by 15,000 years ago in every corner of the habitable world and living in places that would not have even seemed habitable before. From the Arctic to the way south to the various tropical areas, deserts all over the place. Why are we able to do this? Not because our bodies are great for all of these environments, but because in each environment, people start to do different specialized tools, those pressure flaking processes and being able to use different kinds of bones and fine-grained things. Those specialized tools are able to help these Homo sapiens deal with different kinds of climates than their bodies might have been evolved for. They also are always trading and exchanging with each other. So we see from the earliest times, not only people moving around, but continuing to move back and forth, to travel back and forth, and to bring things from one part of the world to another part of the world. It's crazy how many thousands of miles some of these shells and different objects will move and be exchanged throughout human history. In these extreme climates, one of the things that is important is the development of fitted clothing. A lot of the clothing disappears from the archaeological record, but people have figured out that people were wearing clothes because of the divergence in species between the lice that grow on your head and the lice that grow on your body. And that species divergence means that probably fitted clothing comes in because the body lice were living in the clothes, and that's what kept them, made them and helped them develop into different species. It seems to be about 83,000 to maybe somewhere in that range that people start wearing clothes and get itchy in different ways. We also have evidence of more tailored clothing coming in at about 40,000 years ago. So, yes, by the time we get to the 5,000 years ago, people are pretty good at doing this, but we see evidence of this going on about 40,000 years ago, in part because of the lice divergence and in part because the some evidence for needlework. And in these more extreme climates, you need different kinds of shelters. So although people did some very famous art in caves, it doesn't seem like for the most part people lived in caves. Sometimes they would, but the whole idea that there was caveman living in caves is not, probably most people were not doing that or not for very long. You see more sophisticated shelters develop, and your textbook gives you the example of what they call mammoth houses, which have been found in a large swaths of what is now Russia and Ukraine. And these are structures that it's debatable whether people lived in these either, but they were made out of mammoth bones. And in some of these, there's massive quantities of mammoth meat that was sacrificed, enough to last people for months. This is an artist's rendering of what Homo sapien life might have been like at the time, but you have people trading around, gathering in different groups, creating different tools, clothing, structures, and I'm not going to say that they were doing the stuff that we would do today, obviously, but stuff that would perhaps be recognizable in terms of food sharing and mating patterns and those kinds of things. So we have this really incredible spread of Homo sapiens all through the world. We often think of hunter-gatherers as simply roaming around with no place to stay, but they do build these various forms of permanent shelters, and some of these are harder to find because they disappear. We have found archaeologically some really cool, also even some stone monument structures and in what is now Turkey that predate places like Stonehenge. People are able to build, even these smaller groups are able to build these pretty big monumental structures from quite a while ago.